Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, That Model Railway Guy, and welcome to another video about my modular model railway. The previous episode was quite exciting. I got a lot of work done on the two new station modules, laying the track on those, and also even being able to run some trains at the end of it. And I think that video is now the most popular in this series. So thank you so much to everybody who has watched that video and been leaving comments and asking questions. And in fact, on the subject of asking questions, that's kind of what we're going to look at today, because there have been a few things over the course of these videos that I've sort of glossed over or not really gone into full detail about. And a few of you guys have sort of in the comments picked me up on that and said, hey, you didn't really fully explain that, and can you go into more detail on some of these things? So that's what we're going to do today. There is also a bit of troubleshooting to do on the station modules later on, but we'll get to that in a bit. For now though, I want to talk about the Fiddle Yard, and you can see this is the Fiddle Yard here. I don't think I've ever really properly shown this on camera. It did make a very brief appearance in the very first episode of this series, right at the end of that video. But yeah, this is kind of the first time I've properly shown it in its full length. Speaking of the length, it is a double module, so it's the same length as the two station modules, and that is basically so that this goes on one side of the layout and the two station modules go on the other side of the layout, and then the curves connect them up in between. As you can see, it's basically got 5 roads. There's the main line, which runs all the way down the middle, and then there's 2 either side of it with loops. And these loops are basically long enough to hold a tender engine and around 3 to 4 carriages, which is about the length of trains that I'm running on the layout. There's no point in having anything longer really, because that's as long as my station is, and so yeah, it would be a bit of a waste otherwise. There is also at the very end as well, just back here on the 2 outer loops, an extra sort of extension of each siding, I guess, and that's just quite handy for being able to store short trains somewhere else, just keeping them out of the main loops. Or if I'm running in an end-to-end formation, which is where the trains come in at this end, and then they basically don't go any further beyond the Fiddle Yard, it just lengthens the 2 outer loops slightly. So and really there's no need to be able to get back onto the main line at this end if the only way to exit the Fiddle Yard is at the other end. So yeah, that's why I did that. The points on the Fiddle Yard are all set track points. And I imagine there's a few of you now going, why has he done that? There's a couple of good reasons. The first being, I had them lying around. They were going spare. I had an idea for another project that I was going to build. It was going to be a very small thing. I was going to have to use set track points for it. And then I never ended up building it because I decided to make the modular layout instead. But I had all the points and all the track work for it. And so I was thinking, what can I do with these points? And then I realized, aha, I can use them in the Fiddle Yard because no one will see them there. It's kind of the backstage area, so it doesn't particularly matter. So that's why the set track points are here on the Fiddle Yard. The other reason for it as well is that the spacing between the lines on set track points is just slightly wider than the streamline points. It's more realistic on the streamline points, absolutely. But in a Fiddle Yard setting where you've got locos and coaches all sort of crammed quite tight together, it's quite handy to have just a little bit of extra space between the 2 lines, just so that, you know, if you take something off or put something on, you're not accidentally going to knock something else off the rails. So yeah, that's why I did that. I think though, it's time to get to the Fiddle Yard's party trick as such, and that is how it's stored in a way. You might have noticed that there's a couple of little blocks here with hinges on, and that is because the entire Fiddle Yard hinges. And if I just show you now, I'll lift this up and it'll go out of shot at the top here, but I've got a couple of little blocks here as well that it just rests on at the other end to keep it nice and level. And so yeah, I've done this entirely for storage purposes. It doesn't do this when the layout is fully set up because it's bolted in at each end to the other modules that go either side of it. So it's not intended to be like a hinged section that goes across a doorway, for example, where you can lift it up to walk through as opposed to crawling underneath it. This is just purely for storing it. And the reason I've done that is because these Fiddle Yard boards don't have any scenery on them, and so therefore they don't really need a lot of space to store them. And by doing it like this, it means I basically only need to worry about storing 1 module as opposed to storing 2 modules. So yeah, that's why I've done that. If I just open it back up again now, and you can see it's actually really quite easy to do. And so I'm sure a few of you are going to want to know what type of hinges I've used as well. And to be honest, I have absolutely no idea. These are just spare hinges that I had lying around. I think they were in the shed actually. And so yeah, originally they were just put on here temporarily before I'd laid any track or anything, just so I could, you know, fold the 2 modules up and store them safely. And I'm sure there's going to be loads of people in the comments now furiously typing away telling me that I shouldn't have used these types of hinges and it's all going to go horribly wrong in the future. But so far they've actually been really, really good. They're nice and solid. There's no sort of movement in them at all. And actually, if you look at the rails that I've got across here, there's 5 lines here, so that's 10 rails that all need to be aligned. And if I just move this up and down like that, you can see that everything aligns really well, and it's actually all nice and solid, and there's no movement in it at all. So yeah, considering that these were the first two modules that I built and that there's a lot of lines that then need to cross over the baseboard joins, and it was my first time sort of really doing anything like this, I think it's gone incredibly well, and it's certainly sort of stood the test of time so far. You can see in a few places in the cork where I've sort of messed up with the soldering iron a little bit. I'm not really too concerned about it though, because as this is the Fiddle Yard, it's sort of the unseen area of the layout, so people aren't going to be focusing too much attention on this. But yeah, that's kind of a whistle-stop tour of the Fiddle Yard. I hope you have sort of a bit more of an idea of what it entails now, but yeah, let's fold this up and then we'll move on to something else, shall we? So I just thought we'd go on a little bit of a tangent briefly and talk about the wiring, because I know a lot of you have been asking in the comments exactly how I'm doing the wiring, and especially how I'm transferring the power across the different modules, considering that I'm not using fish plates on the ends of each rails. Yeah, it's actually quite simple in reality. It's just a little bit difficult to explain fully in a YouTube comment, so I thought I'd just show you instead because it's much easier. I'm using one of the corner modules to demonstrate this initially, just because this is really simple. This is a single piece of flexible track that runs the entire curve. So there's no track breaks, there's no points or isolating sections or anything like that. So this is pretty much one of the simplest boards on the entire layout. So let's turn it around and you can see what's going on behind. There you go. Hopefully you can see that, but I will do some close-ups for you. Now, essentially underneath I have a red and a black wire that runs across the entire length of the board. So the track starts here and then comes down to this corner here. These red and black wires are essentially my bus wires, so they're the main source of power for the layout, regardless of whether it's on DC or DCC control. And then coming off those, you can see I've then got two feeder wires, again, one red, one black. The colours don't actually matter, it's just a way of keeping everything sort of colour coordinated, so you connect all the red wires to the red wires and all the black wires to the black wires, and then you don't end up with a short circuit. So it just makes things easier. But yeah, and so those wires then run up through the baseboard and then they connect to the underside of each rail. So that's essentially it. To then transfer the power from one board to the next, I have a little connector block here. I have these little chocolate block connectors, but they're a push fit connector. So this one is a socket, and then the one on the other end, you might just be able to see, has prongs on it. And so if I just demonstrate quickly using this bit of wire here, this is actually the wire that comes from my controller, but this one has prongs on it, and so you can see I just push it into the socket like that, and that's it connected. And so if you imagine that these wires were then connected up to another module and they were feeding power to the track on that, that would then, you know, transfer the power along to that module. And then if you had your controller connected up here or another module and then the controller eventually somewhere along in the chain, that's how it's transferring all the power along. Don't forget though that this is the most simple board on the entire layout. So what I think we should do now is have a quick look at the underside of one of the station modules, because there's a lot more point work and sidings and track work going on there. So it's a little bit more complicated. So let's take a look at that now. Okay, so here is the first of the station modules, and this is the one that normally has the shed on it. It's got lots of siding, so the wiring is a bit more involved, which is why I'm showing it to you now. One thing I am doing to keep all the cables tidy underneath is to use these small wire clips on the underside of the baseboard. They have a sticky back which I can just peel off to stick directly to the wood. And once it's stuck down, I can take my wires with the connector attached and then just clip them down so that they're all neat and tidy. The great thing with these is that I can unclip them if I ever need to change the wiring or do some work on it. I also have some cross braces on these modules, and I don't really want the wires getting trapped underneath them, so the best thing to do here is to drill a hole where the wires need to pass through the bracing. And then I just pass the wires through the hole I've made. Obviously you need to do this before you put the connector block on the other end, as the wires won't be able to get through otherwise, but this also does a really good job of keeping all the wiring nice and tidy. Finally, I'll put the connector block on, and these are really easy to install since all you need is a screwdriver. Make sure you've stripped the ends of the wires, and then you can just simply feed them into the holes in the terminal block. And then you just tighten the screws inside so that the wires are held in place before you can clip it back to the baseboard. By the way, if anyone is wondering, these connector blocks are rated for 10 amps, which is more than enough for me since the wires are rated for 5 amps and my controller can't go above 3 amps anyway, so there's lots of headroom there. On this module there's also a secondary bus that comes off the main power bus, and this feeds the sidings on the layout. I put a connector block in the chain here, and this allows me to reconnect it for when I'm running on DCC, or I can simply disconnect it for when I'm running on DC so that the power is routed via the points instead. And there we go, that's pretty much all of the wiring on this module. Obviously it's just track power at the moment, so it will get a bit more complicated as I start adding point motors and lights, but for now I'm quite pleased with how all this has worked out. So one of the big advantages with building a modular model railway is that it means I can work on it in sections without having to have the entire layout set up. For example, right now I just have the shed module here, and that's because I'm going to be doing some work on the track today, and most specifically the points. Now, if you've seen any of the live streams that I've been doing, which I do on my channel whenever I hit a subscriber milestone, they're good fun, you should go and check them out. But if you've seen any of those live streams, you'll know I've been having a little bit of trouble with some of the locos stalling on the points. I should say it's not all of the locos. In fact, like 95% of my locos are absolutely fine. The big tender engines, for example, they get over the points no problem whatsoever. They've got lots of wheels and pickups, and so therefore they very rarely lose contact. Funnily enough though, the tiny little Peckett, the 040 Peckett, and also the Ruston 48DS, these don't have any trouble getting over the points, and there's quite a few of them back to back here with a double slip in the middle. Even if everything was working okay, I would expect them to stall occasionally, but so far they've been absolutely fine. In fact though, it's actually the 060s that are having trouble getting over these points, and most specifically the Bachmann J72, that's the worst offender. Initially I thought it was an issue with the loco itself, so I took it off the track, cleaned the wheels, checked the pickups and everything, and that was all fine. I tried it again and no, still the problem was there. I then thought maybe it was a DCC issue, so I took the decoder out and then just put a blanking plate back in the loco, ran it on normal DC, and the problem got a little bit better, but it still wasn't great. So I do think the decoder was just sort of a little bit sensitive to stalls perhaps, and so I've changed some of the CV settings and tweaked things, and it is a little bit better, but I'm still not entirely confident in this loco. So I think I know what the problem is. I think it is an issue with the track, and I think I know how to solve it. So let's have a closer look at that now. So if I run the J72 in again, we can see it stops on the points in a very specific position. What I started noticing though was that when I went to push the engine to restart it, it had a tendency to rock, and if I press down lightly on the funnel here, you can see that the engine does sort of jump on the track a bit. What I think this means is that the points aren't completely level in some places, which is causing some locos, the 060s in particular, to rock on their centre axles, which lift the wheels on one side. With the loco out of the way, you can see that the frog on some of the points is slightly higher than the rest of it, and I can actually push it down with my finger. I don't know if this was already a slightly bowed point, or if it's just bad track laying. I suspect it's probably the latter, but I think I do have a way to fix it. With all the power turned off, I use a screwdriver just to lift the track up ever so slightly off the baseboard so that there's a small gap underneath the frog. I then have a syringe filled with PVA glue, and I'm just putting a tiny amount underneath the frog. The excess was then cleaned up with a cotton bud, since I was a bit nervous about putting glue near the points anyway, so I wanted to make sure that there wasn't any extra that could end up in unwanted places. With the glue applied, I added some weight directly to the top of the points to hold them down, and then I spent the next few hours with my fingers crossed waiting for it all to dry. I know PVA may not be ideal for using on plastic, but I opted for this instead of something like super glue because I didn't want it to be too permanent if it does all go wrong. Hopefully this will work, but if it doesn't I may have to lift the track, and if that's the case then it'll be much harder removing the points if they're super glued in place, where with PVA it'll be a bit easier to get them out. Okay, so it's now the following day and I let the glue dry overnight, and I took the weights off this morning, and actually it's done a fairly good job. I also noticed at the same time that I was sort of trying to glue down those bits that were sticking up that there were a few little dips in the track as well, and so I've just sort of used a little bit of card to kind of pack those a bit and just kind of raise the levels up a bit, so hopefully that's also helped a little bit as well. But I tested the J72 earlier on and it now runs over this section really well actually. The only bit I'm having trouble with is this section just here, right between the double slip and and the point that leads into the second platform. I guess I'm just going to have a closer look at that at some point, but the J72 will actually still run through it if it's got a bit of speed behind it. It's just if I want it to absolutely crawl through the exit of that point, it does still have the occasional tendency to stall. However, let's show you the J72 running on the rest of these points. And remember from yesterday, it was stalling quite a lot when I did this, and now I can run it at a moderate speed without it stalling at all, and especially through the double slip, it's pretty good. Now this is the troubling section here, and as you can see, it's made it through there without too much trouble, as I said, if it's got a bit of speed behind it. And if we run it back now, it'll end up stalling now. Yeah, so you can see there, if I run it a little bit slower, it does sort of tend to stall. And so it's just that small little section there, and as soon as you get past that, it's absolutely fine for the rest of it. So it's not 100% perfect yet, but remember that this is an issue with one specific loco in one specific area of the entire layout. So hopefully it shouldn't take too much trouble to solve at some point in the future. Anyway, that's going to be it for this time, guys. Thank you so much for watching. And if you haven't already, then please do subscribe to the channel and hit that bell icon to get notifications. And I'll see you in the next video. Bye!